one of the blessings of COVID, I suppose, or the good things to come out of COVID, is to be able to meet together on things like this, which we wouldn't normally be able to do. So welcome to everyone. We have a little sort of plug to make, which is that we would love to have donations. I'll say a bit more about joining the association at the end, but Bonnie will put a link to that in the chat function at some point during the talk. And before I get started, I just wanted to say a brief overview about the series. This is really something that I got thinking about this because of Helen McPhail, who, as you know, used to chair the association for many years, and she had emailed me in November to say what's happening with the anniversary of the 1920 edition, and we sort of had a little chat about that, and it got me thinking that maybe for this new sort of start of the year that we would take advantage of what COVID has made us do, which is to go online and to try and read that edition as a group over the coming year. So we're going to be taking 2 poems every month on the first Thursday of every month and have a discussion, and you're welcome to join. You don't have to come every month. It'd be nice if you did, but just to sort of get our kind of ideas together, what we think of the poems. It's not meant to be an academic sort of discussion or lecture, really just appealing to all sorts of readers of Owen, whether you know a lot about him or not very much, and to think about how various people respond to the poems and what your thoughts are. Each month will be led by a moderator who will give us a kind of structure and say a bit about those particular poems in question. But then we hope to open it up to the floor to get ideas and just have a general chat about this really important piece of literature, really. Our first grouping, our first gathering of that particular part of the series will be led by Meg Crane, who is our journal editor of the Association Journal. And we look forward to seeing you then. All those are all on Eventbrite. How to access the edition. First of all, please come with any copy of the poems that you wish. I would say that I'd recommend John Stallworthy's edition, but any edition will be fine. I realize that most people won't have a copy of the 1920 edition. It's very rare. If you do, don't invite me to your house because I may try and steal it. But you can actually look at it online through archive.org, and I'm going to put a link to that on my slides. So we will get going on the slides. I'll share my screen. Sorry, can I just remind everyone to mute themselves so that there isn't too much background noise. It's been a long day of teaching, so I might get confused if I hear too much in the background, so thank you. Okay, so I hope everyone is seeing my screen. I just need to get the sharing function up. Boy, you wouldn't think I did this for a living, would you? I need to get rid of that particular bit. How do I do that?
I think you can just go on view and then...
Oh, there it is. Yeah. Thank you, Bonnie. Okay, so back again. There we go. Is everyone seeing the screen clearly? Yep. Brilliant. Thank you. So I've entitled this "His Work Will Not Easily Die," which will be apparent as to why I've used that as I go through. But really, as I mentioned, you can access the 1920 edition by going to archive.org. And I think we gave the links on the invitation to this event. And you're able then to kind of flip through the pages and to actually see that edition. I did have a look on Abe Books today, and there is a first edition, first impression with the dust jacket, which was on sale for £9,000. So, but most of them are about £2,000. So well done you if you have a copy of that. I'll have to start saving up. But it is available to have a look at. But before we really talk about that edition, it's important to recognize that it has a much longer history. It was already, as people who know about Owen, in preparation before he died in that last year of his life. He had 5 poems published in his lifetime in the Hydra, in the Nation and the Bookman, in particular. So he was able to call himself a published poet and to see his work in print. But it wasn't a huge amount of work that he was able to see, but he was working on it. And he talks about this in his letters to Susan, to his mother, and to other individuals. This is the example of where his, this is the Nation, the issue that he appeared in. And he writes to her in from Scarborough in January of 1918, after he's been to Craiglockhart. And he says, with your beautiful letter came a proof from the Nation of my minors, which he also called the coal poem at the beginning. This is the first poem I have sent to the Nation myself, and it has evidently been accepted. It was scrawled on the back of a note to the editor. No penny stamp or addressed envelope was enclosed to return. That's the way to do it. Minors will probably appear next Saturday, but don't order a copy. So I love that sort of discussion about this is how you get things published. Just send it off and don't send a return so they can't possibly send it back to you. But of course, this was just the sort of beginnings of his annus mirabilis, as we say. And of course, he had been introduced to a coterie of literary figures via Sassoon, to Robert Graves, to Osbert Sitwell in particular, and people who gave him an entree into sort of the literary world that he wouldn't ordinarily have had. He writes to his mother in May of that year that he had, after he'd been up to London, he said, my reception in London has been magnificent. The upshot is that I am to have my work typed at once and sent to Heinemann, who is to send it to Ross to read for him. That is Robert Ross. It is very subtle. Ross first meant to take it himself. We thought thought this independent idea a great joke. And this is a picture of William Heinemann, the publisher, who was a really important British publisher of the early 20th century. And he published a great deal of sort of really important, now canonical, First World War books, including Enid Bagnold's A Diary Without Dates, Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone, Philip Gibbs's The Soul of War, and of course Sassoon. So he was a really important publisher to have gotten to know. And this sort of interaction between Ross and Heinemann is a good illustration of that kind of literary world and the machinations and how texts become what they are, how they get into our hands as readers. There's a whole backstory to this and a whole kind of society and a culture that Owen was now being introduced to and was on his way to becoming important in. Of course, Heinemann wasn't the only one that showed an interest. The Sitwells were particularly interested in his work, and they wanted some of his work for their anthology, Wheels, which was founded by Edith Sitwell. She's one of the sort of perhaps unsung heroes of this, and I'm going to highlight her a bit. But with the assistance of her brother Osbert, who had met Owen, and they had wanted some material for their 1918 edition. And Owen writes to Osbert Sitwell in July of 1918 from Scarborough to say that last week I broke out of camp to order Wheels, 1917. Canning, that is the bookshop in Scarborough, refused to stock copies. I persisted so long that the young lady loudly declared she knew all along that I was Osbert himself. This caused a consternation throughout the crowded shop, but I got the last laugh by, "No, madam, the book is by a friend of mine, Miss Sitwell." Rigby's people would not order a single copy without deposit. Is the 1918 volume designed to go on the caterpillar wheels of Siegfried's music hall tank? If so, I might help with the ammunition. Wonderful use of language there. Would you like some short poems or what? Please give me a final date for submitting them to you. So we really see Owen maturing into a sort of very self-confident individual where, you know, he isn't this sort of shaky figure that we tend to think of him as. He really was developing his personality as a literary figure, however tentatively. And I think this letter particularly indicates a sense of humor, his ability to kind of create this scene. You can imagine him standing in this bookshop and speaking to this woman. No, madam, I love it. So it's his real ability to present us with what he's seeing. It's a great character writer, I think, as well. But of course, he doesn't manage this. And he doesn't manage to fulfill his promise. We know that over the course of the last year of his life, he begins assembling the volume that he had titled Disabled and Other Poems. He begins to write a number of drafts of tables of contents, and drafts, of course, his famous manifesto, which was still left in draft at his death. It has been left to various scholars to construct and to see as what might have been the final form. And that's one of the first things we're going to look at when we, and Meg will look at when we meet together in the beginning of next month. And of course, so many of the phrases of that have become his epitaph and become some of the most quoted phrases in literature. People have used it for many different things, the pity of war in particular. So of course, Owen is killed on the 4th of November, 1918, a week before the armistice. And so therefore the management of his literary estate, as it were, falls to the poets that he met in the last year of his life, to those connections, and I would say to Susan Owen, who I'm going to say a bit more about in a minute. And the next couple of letters that I want to share are some of the correspondence that Edith Sitwell had with Susan Owen, asking for the manuscripts and for Susan's permission. And I think it's a most interesting way in which she writes to Susan, how she saw this mourning. Sitwell was very conscious of Susan, mother in mourning. She writes to her in March of 1919, I am most anxious, if you allow me, to publish some of the poems in the next number of Wheels, the anthology I edit. I am particularly anxious to have the honor of producing some of the war poems. If you don't mind me saying so, I consider them among the very finest poems of the war. And she tells Susan that she's in a subsequent letter about how she's going to make this selection. She says that the poems are without exaggeration so magnificent that it's almost impossible to choose. And she says that it's such a great privilege and a sacred honor to be able to write to you. And she says how proud you must be to be the mother of such a son. And later, each time I write to you, I write with the reverence and humility with which I should have written to Dante's mother. You have given the world the greatest poet of our time. And it's very hyperbolic, very over the top, but indicative, I think, of the way in which Sitwell, I think, recognized Susan and her position, and was seeing this really as a way in which she could remember and commemorate her son. And then—
Sorry to just jump in really quickly.
Yes.
I think some of you still have your mics on. I can't mute you manually, so if you could just quickly make sure that you're all on mute, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Yes, so she writes to her on the 3rd of November, 1919, of course, a most important date, because it's the day before the first anniversary of Owen's death. And she writes to Susan, if only one could express what one feels ever. My heart aches for you. I am dumb when I think what not only you, his mother, but we all have lost. I shall keep the 4th of November always, as long as I live, as a day of mourning. I know you are heartbroken, but oh, you are just the mother for such a son. Tomorrow his first poems in book form will be with you, the immortality of his great soul. What a wonderful moment it will be for you, though with agony too. And of course, Wheels was published with this dedication, dedicated to the memory of Wilfred Owen, MC, published by Blackwell's in 1919, and included these poems. It included Strange Meeting, The Show, The Sentry, Auteur, Disabled, The Deadbeat, and The Chances. So really the poems that are really important to Owen's legacy, ones that we remember and repeat now. So they first really reach a sort of wider public in this way. And there is a kind of sacred status that Sitwell gives to Owen. And each time, but at the same time being quite conscious, I think, of paying that particular reverence to Susan as his mother. So I think that the issue around women and Owen is one that has yet to be really fully explored. Oh, here is a wonderful cover of Wheels where Sitwell's also said, these poems should overwhelm anybody who really cares for poetry. I'm telling everyone I know about these wonderful and terrible poems. It's a wonderful cover by, I think it's Wyndham Lewis. So how is Wheels received? Well, what's interesting when we look at the reception of Wheels is that that Owen tended to be singled out in many ways. And this one review from the Saturday Review in January 1920, where the reviewer is having a look at reviewing May Wedderburn Cannon's collection of poems, The Splendid Days. May Wedderburn Cannon, also an amazing First World War female poet. And amongst these, of course, Wheels. But what the reviewer singles out is interesting, that he singles out Owen. Let us add only out of Wheels 1919, this pacifist cry, even more terrible on the lips of Wilfred Owen, who was killed by the war in the strange meeting of two dead enemies. And he quotes from Strange Meeting, and of course the famous line, I am the enemy you killed, my friend. And writes, alas, young poets, beauty and youth are the enemy we have all killed. And even you who remember these and remind us cannot save them, being their friends. But then the work goes on to create what we now have as the 1920 edition. And this carried on over the period here. I'll say a bit more about sort of the issues around that editing, but we know that Sassoon writes the introduction, and we have a record of a letter to Siegfried Sassoon sent on the 11th of October 1920, which is just before the book is published officially in December, where she writes, Chatto and Windus, as the publisher, have kindly sent me a proof of the introduction you have so wonderfully written for Wilfred's book. It is just what I wished, what he would have wished, and it is true. And Susan has a wonderful way with words. The way that she's writing to Sassoon in particular is quite interesting to think about the language she uses. They become quite close. She always addresses him, however, as Mr. Sassoon, as she does Blunden later on in the late 1920s when he's preparing the 1930 edition. Always very grateful for the help that they have given her. She's sending the manuscripts in most cases through the post, which we would now find horrifying now, how many things might have gotten lost. So there was a sort of casualness with the way in which people were sending the manuscripts around, but it all managed to get done. What's interesting, however, is that really most of the work was done by Edith Sitwell, apologies to our friends in the Siegfried Sassoon Fellowship who are here this evening, but Sitwell was not best pleased with Captain Sassoon. as you can tell by this letter to Susan, which she writes in late January of 1920. Captain Sassoon has suddenly gone off to America, leaving all your son's manuscripts to me to get ready for the printers by the 1st of February. Captain Sassoon has done nothing in the way of preparing them. All he has done in this matter is to arrange with Chatto and Windus to publish them. I can't help but feel a little vexed, and I'm sure it was a lot more than vexed, with Captain Sassoon, not because it entails extra work to me, but because I think I need not tell you that no work could be too great for me to do with the greatest joy and greatest pride that will help make your son's glorious work known, but simply that I have been hanging about waiting to hear when I might have been working at them. Still, they will be done in time. Trust me for that. So it's in some ways typical perhaps of women's labor that we might be thinking about in this context. And in fact, the book simply says the introduction by Sassoon. It doesn't mention Sitwell. But she does get it ready in time. And of course, this is just an example of the ad from one of the ads that appeared in the various sorts of trade and periodical press. It's the ad put into the Athenaeum, one really important periodical in the 20th century, and noting Chatto and Windus's various lists for new books, and among them, of course, poems by the late Wilfred Owen MC, with an introduction by Siegfried Sassoon, no mention of Edith Sitwell, and priced at 6 shillings net, which was a standard price for this. So I'm sure that they would be amazed to find out how much those copies are going for on Abe Books now. And again, the supplement, the autumn publishing season, poetry, again, the poems by the late Wilfred Owen MC. Our readers will remember the striking poems published in these pages, and indeed he had some individual poems published posthumously in the Athenaeum, and with the judgment passed on those portions of Owen's work which appeared in Wheels. So all of these things are kind of getting really linked together, and quite interestingly to note that in this particular ad, we have John Clare poems, chiefly from the manuscripts, edited by Edmund Blunden. So here it is. This is the edition with its frontispiece of the portrait, with its lovely sort of, what was the word I'm looking for? The tissue paper covering the portrait. Most editions that you will get now don't include the dust jacket, which it did have, which is probably why that one particular one was especially expensive. It was produced in a print run of 750 copies, which was not a lot, but a standard really for poems of this kind. And the second impression was prepared. There were another 700 copies that were printed of that. So that's why it's a relatively rare book. And when you think, I think there was probably 30 or 300,000 of Brooks poems that were published. So it was a decent number for a new poet. But there were still sort of copies, unbound copies around in the 1920s in the offices of Chatto and Windus. So this is again why it's much rarer to own a copy. So what was its reception? The Manchester Guardian reviewed it, and this is from where I got the title of this talk. The 23 poems of this collection are the fruit of not quite 2 years' active service, less than half of it in the field, but they are enough to rank him among the very few war poets whose work has more than a passing value. Others have shown the disenchantment of war, but none with such compassion for the disenchanted and justly stern judgment on the idolizers. You know, wonderful. So even before the sort of war books boom in the 1930s, people are, and I will mention him in a minute, my very dear colleague Vincent Trott, who's worked on the publishing history, has noted that even before the war books boom, before the sort of disillusionment aspect of the war takes hold, people are noticing this about Owen's work. He glorifies the soldier, but as victim, not as victor, and whose sacrificial love passes the love of women. His verse, as he says in his preface, is all of the pity of war. The pity gets itself into the poetry. It is the poetry of pain, searing and piercing to pity. It is the poetry of the tragic muse. He has revealed the soul of the soldier as no one else has revealed it. His work will not easily die. And they were right, I suppose. And the Sunday Times also reviewed it in December, saying that Owen has done something to secure that the war, as real as the real soldier knew it, shall not be hidden by the old cover of lies. So again, recognizing this idea that there was the lies that were happening, this narrative of the war that we have come to know was already taking place and being recognized. But this idea of the real soldier also coming through, which of course reappears when the memoirs of Blunden and Sassoon and Graves are published later, this issue of Truth. And just to show, again, being noticed and really just trying to show the way in which Owen is reaching a reading public. The Bookman, which was a trade periodical, a monthly periodical, features it in its news notes section in January, featuring the introduction by Sassoon, lauding it, agreeing with him that it revealing humanity touches with the beauty of poetry, things of pity and terror, and makes the barbarism and wrong that gave rise to them the more abhorrent by contrast. When time winnows the war poets, as it will, which is quite interesting in and of itself, Wilfred Owen will be among the few that will survive. So I think these were really quite prescient in terms of what we now know as Owen's longer term reputation. And I just want to point out, as I said, I mentioned Vincent Trott here, and anyone interested in the way in which the publishing and the creation of the First World War occurs should really have a look at his book, Publishers' Readers in the Great War. And he really notes that even at this early stage, Owen was far from obscure or unfashionable. He's beginning now, of course, to be included in anthologies, and this is one of the ways in which his work is disseminated and read by a wide readership. So it's not really from the 1920 edition. That was a much smaller print run, a much smaller group of people who would have owned that. But the fact that he's in anthologies, the Anthology of Modern Verse, included the great poems that we now know, and the review in the Manchester Guardian again picks out Owen as the finest thing, being his Strange Meeting. So, and within 5 months, 5 editions of this particular anthology had been published, and around 20,000 copies sold. So this is reaching a wide readership. And as Vincent said, Owen's poetry evidently reached a wider audience in the early 1920s than has been previously suggested. So I think that's a really interesting, it's a really, really interesting study, really interesting point about the fact that Owen was not just obscure, he had a following. And one of the ways we might illustrate this is to think about where he appears in some of the discussion of the time. So even in an article fittingly for Owen's love of Keats, on Keats and the poetry of our time, Thomas Moult, writing in the Fortnightly Review in February 1921, refers to Owen in the context of John Keats dying at 25, had there been no European war, etc. And he mentions at the bottom, but old complacencies and contentments have been rudely rebuffed by recent happenings, and we find ourselves following the presages of his early doom with the same pitiful sense of futility, really words we associate with Owen, and mischance that is in our thought of our later millions of young and lovely dead, poets in their last earthly aspiration, no less than were rarer spirits among them whom we mourn as Rupert Brooke, Wilfred Owen, Edward Thomas. So he's being put in this pantheon already. The Saturday Review, somebody writing about reviewing Stephen McKenna's probably, I don't even know if anyone's read this ever since it was published, why I remember mentioning the fact that he should be really looking at the work of Wilfred Owen if he's going to be thinking about the poetry of war. He should be looking at him as well as Julian Grenfell and Robert Graves. He comes up, Wilfred Owen appears in Gerald Gould's contribution to an article that Harold Monroe, owner of the Poetry Bookshop, had put out as a kind of question to various literary figures in 1921, and Gerald Gould writes in your invitation to suggest what poets and poems should be added to this golden treasury that Monroe was suggesting, I would suggest of the recently dead the following, and of course among them Wilfred Owen, alongside Edward Thomas and Rupert Brooke. In a review of modern poetry, the reviewer from 1922 is saying, what academic aloofness compels Mr. Clarke to deny to Wilfred Owen the title of poetry? And he's quoting it. How could you possibly leave this out with this kind of work that he was producing? The Saturday Review, I love this title, An Impertinent Anthology, because Mr. Pertwee's ignorance of the young writers, he really can't stand this. We refuse to believe that these various people should be there when people like Mr. Blunden isn't there, or Miss Muriel Stewart or Mr. Banford. We haven't heard of them really, we don't remember them, but Mr. Graves, Wilfred Owen, misspelt, Mr. Huxley, Mr. Wilfred Child. Why is Miss Edith Sitwell excluded? Has created a new and fascinating technique, etc., etc. So Owen is entered this literary milieu even after he's died. And of course, by 1922, the Manchester Guardian can actually start saying, how is it that a book such as the anthology Poems of Today, which draws mostly from younger men who have written mainly under the influence and reactions of the war, has left out Wilfred Owen, who by that token should have been the very first choice. And in a letter to Sassoon, Susan Owen remarks to him in 1923, I have 8 copies of 8 anthologies which contain Wilfred's poems, kindly sent to me by the publishers. I want to have all that there are. Dear boy, how pleased and proud he would have been to see his work among that of the men he admired so much and loved. So this is how his reputation is built. And these books, especially to Susan, of course, become her memorials to her son. And I think that's something that we shouldn't underestimate. And I want to finish with this recognition of Susan, because I think she gets left out in many ways, or perhaps even vilified for being a bit of a smother mother. But we have to recognize her important role in ensuring that her son had his posthumous due. And Harold Owen writes very movingly in Journey from Obscurity that for Tom Owen, for Owen's father, there was immense relief that this unexpected emergence of Wilfred's poetry was now bringing Wilfred back to mother, filling in the devastating cavity, not with something else to take the place of Wilfred, but with Wilfred himself and his work, which is now coming to life. Tom says, it is her right. She must have this, all that is left of Wilfred. When he was alive, I could not always be sympathetic to his obsession for writing. Now it is too late. This is something that belongs to mother. I will not usurp it. And so I think maybe perhaps it's fitting to end on this little bit of a tribute to Susan, for whom, without her and her careful, well, it was a rather haphazard keeping of a lot of the manuscripts and letters, but she did actually preserve his work. And as H.G. Pitt says in a really interesting piece from Essays in Criticism, Susan Owen believed passionately in her eldest son, and her spoiling of him was a crucial protection of the poet's sensitivity in a bruising world. The spoils of that protection are ours. So those are my sources. And I would be happy to take any questions that folks might have. These are my sources. I maybe will, actually, we'll have one more slide, which is simply to say, do join us at the association. Bonnie will put the link in the chat as well. But I'll stop the screen share and take any questions you might have, and then I can see people. Thank you.
There aren't any questions in the chat, but the floor's open for anyone who wants to.
Oh, okay. I saw some coming into the chat, so.
You're muted.
Sorry, could I?
Typical, the woman is left with all the work. Yes, that's what I thought, Deb, actually. It kind of runs through. I think that's actually a good comment. It's one I was sort of thinking of as the women behind the scenes in this. And I count Susan and Edith Sitwell amongst that. And I do find it a particular irony that many on the committee are women, including its chair, its previous chair, its chair before that, and as one of the two of three trustees are women as well. So there you go.
Thank you all. It was lovely talk, Jane.
Thank you. But I'm happy to take questions.
I had one rather general point. I mean, yes. I think it's, thank you very much for the talk, it's lovely. And I think it's great to sort of discover Owen becoming a phenomenon as quickly as he did after his death. But it seems to me that at the same time as he became something of a phenomenon in the world of poets, actually poetry itself became something of a phenomenon in a way that it's never been before. I mean, we had Tennyson and even Brooks before, but actually the First World War poets brought poetry to life and to the world. 20,000 sales of an anthology is really quite fantastic, it seems to me.
It is, yeah. Sorry, I can't see who's speaking.
Sorry, it's Mark Cardale.
Oh, there you are. Oh, Mark, you don't have your camera on. Sorry, I couldn't tell. Sorry, Mark. Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, sorry?
Somebody else.
Hi, Mark. Thank you. Hi. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways of looking at it, though. I think that poetry had a particular currency in the early 20th century that it doesn't have now. I think that we talk about the sort of war poetry boom during the First World War, and you know, Graves talks about this. But there was poems were in newspapers, poems were in periodicals in ways that they aren't now, and that they, I think, gradually came not to be. So I think you're right. I think I want to sort of say, the 20s and 30s are really kind of the apex of this, because the sort of we just don't, we're not as conversant with sort of poems, I don't think, anymore. I mean, if you're a poetry enthusiast, you are, but I think you're right. This selling of 20,000 copies of an anthology, amazing.
Absolutely.
And that was only one anthology. He was in a number of others, and as Susan says, I have 8 anthologies that he's in. And I haven't traced all of those to see what their print runs are, but this is where the sort of the business aspects of publishing and book history are quite illuminating, really, because they give us an idea of sales, and publishers, as we know, wouldn't publish stuff unless it's sold. And you can imagine that probably some of these were passed around or might have been in libraries, so the readership was going to even be bigger.
Was it Yeats who stopped him from being in the Golden Treasury?
No, it wasn't the Golden Treasure. It's the Oxford Book of English Verse.
Oh, thank you.
Famous one in 1930.
You didn't like him at all, did he?
Yeah, he wasn't worthy of a poet's corner of a country newspaper. But of course, it's Stallworthy and others have shown that he got that quite wrong, and it was really, it was an idea of what constituted.
So that was in the what? That wasn't the Golden Treasure. It was which?
No.
Question. James, going to what you were saying earlier about the circulation of poetry during the war.
Yes.
I mean, there were a huge number of volumes produced, particularly by serving soldiers, as well as
indeed
the literary canon. I mean,
yes.
The shelves in dusty stacks are full of them. The motives for them, I think, generally came down to three things. Either they were produced by families or friends as memorials to those who had died. And that, of course, particularly applied to the sort of the gilded class, the public school boys, the officers. A lot of them were designed to raise money. So they were published as charitable sort of fundraising. And a lot of the other stuff, particularly that appeared in Punch and newspapers, was morale raising. So there was a lot going on. And I mean, there are examples, as you will know, in Owen's letters of comments between him and Sassoon about, well, to be blunt, the dross.
Yes. Oh, yes.
That they felt they had to counteract.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And was coming out of that during the war, as well as in those reviews that you referred to, where people were saying, how can you miss these people out when you're talking about war poetry, supposedly?
Exactly. It's the same thing. And actually, one of the things that gets left out of the letters, which I'm reinstituting in my edition, which should be out this year, is he was particularly, both of them were particularly scathing about Leslie, his cousin, and his cousin's poems were that bit of the dross that they, far too many kisses in it, he said. But yes, charitable. I mean, I'm looking on my shelves and seeing I've got these sort of lined up, but yeah, to sold for the benefit of the Red Cross. Dominic Hibbard, the late, God rest his soul, did a really interesting sort of discussion about the publisher Erskine MacDonald, who took advantage of suggested that he took advantage of bereaved families and and he said he was notoriously bad at passing on royalties to those who had deceased. So there was he called it a bit of a publishing scam, but he nevertheless also published Vera Brittain and Edmund Blunden. So, but yeah, I mean, the volume of poetry was enormous. I find it fascinating, actually.
Yeah,
Yes.
hello. Sorry, I can't see myself. I don't know whether anyone can see me.
Robert, yeah.
Robert Fanshawe here.
Hello.
I just wanted to follow up on actually what Mark was saying, because thanks for your talk, actually, it was brilliant. Thank you so much. But you didn't mention how the establishment, the poetry establishment really sort of took to Owen or not. I mean, obviously, there's that famous quote of Yeats's, isn't there, about that he wouldn't publish his poetry in a Sunday magazine of a poetry corner or whatever. I mean, I did an English literature, well, just 1 year of an English literature degree in 1990 or something, and I brought into an essay about war poetry, and it was Exeter University actually, and the tutors, oh well, that's quite interesting, yeah, and there's kind of been the establishment poetry and war poetry, and my question is, when did they really begin to mix after the 1920 publication? Have they ever?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, it's just a lot of people. There's also quite a lot of really. I see people, my fellow scholars who know a lot more than me about the sort of acceptance level of it. I mean, Owen has a really interesting, I think, arc of, there was a tendency to think he wasn't well known, and further research that shows that, he was well known enough for someone like Yeats to go, no, we're not having him in there. And I think the war poetry, and particularly First World War poetry, sort of became much more in the public consciousness, and certainly Owen in a wider sort of international sense with in the 1960s. I think that's certainly true. Sorry, what was, oh, sorry. Particularly with War Requiem, and then the changes in the curriculum. And once the war poets get on the curriculum, then it becomes much more widespread. I mean, I think in terms of the question about Owen and the establishment, though, I will say probably the most illustrative thing about it, there are two things. One is that Owen was not included in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography until the 1980s, and he was in the volume called Missing Persons. Okay, so that was scooping up all the people that hadn't made it into the dictionary at that point. And then when it was eventually revised for its 2004 revival, which is now going on as the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, he was, of course, incorporated fully, but he wasn't in those original ones. The fact that Owen's letters are in Texas and not in Oxford is partly to do with the fact that Harold Owen had offered the letters to the Bodleian in the 70s, and they kind of dragged their feet about it, whoever was in charge, and eventually they went to auction at Sotheby's and winged their way to Texas. And then, of course, later after Harold's death, then his widow Phyllis donated the rest of the material that was part of the family collection, which is why there are a lot of the sort of the photographs and ephemera and physical objects, material objects are now in the Weston. So that gives you an idea of sort of how people maybe thought about Owen or the war poets more specifically. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, thank you so much. Quite a lot of that was, for some reason it went off, but no, that's a good answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jane, there's questions in the chat. There's quite a few.
Yes, okay. Let me just, let me just go through very quickly and see if I can catch. Published anywhere else during the war. Oh, yeah, sorry, Sarah Ashton. Yes, you missed the start. No, it was published in The Nation. There was a couple poems published in The Nation and in the Bookman. He won a poetry prize in the Bookman. Paul, the manuscripts, how they were selected in the exchange. No, it doesn't really say how they made the selection. I can't quite get at that. Partly, I suppose, what was sort of maybe considered for wheels, and then the additional material that they had. Sorry, Bonnie, I might need your help going through these. Yeah, David Ryan mentioned Edith said that if she were addressing Dante's mother, is that due in part to Strange Meeting being almost a condensed Inferno? Yes, I'm sure that was partly. That's a really interesting connection. I hadn't actually linked it. I was thinking more in terms of her, trying to think of someone that she could compare him to, but I think that yes, perhaps it is to do with Strange Meeting. I think that's very interesting. Do you find it slightly odd? This is from Jonathan, is it Cape or Cape? Oh, Caperon, excuse me. Find it slightly odd that Sitwell, whose own poetry is bizarre, was such a champion. Not necessarily. I think, I don't know. No, I think she was such a champion of modernist and proto-modernist verse and just modern poetry generally, that I think she was taken by it. And of course, much of even reviewers have commented on the way that Owen was playing with language and stuff, I think would have really appealed to her. David Woodward, as a general observation, Owen's manuscripts seem to have been particularly prone to overworking. How accurate were the anthologies to the texts we recognize today? And how confident are you of the overall accuracy of published versions? As much as I can be. I think it's a great question because so much of Owen's work is in manuscript form. I think we tend to, and I would say that John Stallworthy's Complete Poems and Fragments is the authoritative edition because he had worked with the manuscripts, trying to date them, trying to come to as much of an urtext, an accepted authorized version as he could. That will probably always be a source of debate by scholars, especially by poets. And it is interesting to think about that Owen's work was edited by poets. So the argument is, of course, that those poets are making decisions around what word he crossed out, what line, reconstructing lines against their own poetic ear. And that happened with Sitwell, it happened with Blunden, it happened with Cecil Day-Lewis, it happened with John Stallworthy. So we, unless we can't really, ask Owen, so we have to go with what we've got. So I think it's always open. And one of the things that might be interesting to discuss over the course of the sort of monthly meetings is to maybe think about those different versions and what we think of it. Approach Owen, excuse me, oh, it's the scrolling mechanism. Tim Bell, I approach Owen from the military history perspective, especially his regiment, so much to learn from his poems. Links to the archive be posted on Twitter. Yes, I can do that, yes. And Julia, hello. Where are you, Julia? Rolling function. Yes, Julia Ribeiro has done so much work on French First World War poets, says that the trends can apply to French poetry. And what Jane said about war poesy, a swan song of a usage of poetry we're no longer familiar with in the late 20th and 21st century. And Paul Norgate's point about the typography of war poetry's adjectives. Yes, thank you. Meg asked, Meg Craig, do we have any idea whether Wilfred Owen ever did actually submit a collection to Heinemann? If he did and was refused, what does it tell him about the reigning composition of those? I don't think he ever did. As far as I know, he never managed to get it to him. He was still doing stuff in draft. But it's a good question. I mean, it'd be great to maybe, I would think people have mined the Heinemann archive already to see if that's happened. So my impression is he never managed to actually get it to Heinemann. Thank you, Andrew, for your nice comments. As 20-something poems, is there any record of discussion about which to admit? Not really that I've found. And I still have to do some digging. And when I was thinking about this, I thought, really, I need to get back into an archive. But alas, the letters that I have from Susan to Sassoon don't really say, she doesn't discuss that with them. So I think the decision about what she very much left those decisions to the poets, and whether there is maybe something in between the correspondence in Blunden and Sassoon later on, perhaps, but I haven't looked into that yet. And that's something I think would be really interesting to know.
Jane, could I just chip in there?
Yes, of course, please.
Blunden and Sassoon, certainly, like you, I'm not aware of any correspondence that's available, but actually that the physical evidence is the folios in the British Library.
Yes, yes.
They are organised on the principle that volume 1 is what Sassoon and Blunden between them rated.
Yes.
A being the better poems and B being the best versions of those poems.
That's right. That's right. Yes, exactly.
They then went into volume 2, so that they clearly were negotiating, as it were, a hierarchy.
Yes, yes.
I agree with everybody who's asked the questions that it was very interesting to know where those decisions first came. I mean, the correspondence between Owen and Osbert Sitwell that you mentioned about what shall I send you and what would you like, and do you want this or do you want that? And then, as some people watching will know, there is a small cache of material at Renishaw Hall, the home of the Sitwells.
Yes.
Osbert claims is what Owen sent him.
That's right, yeah.
Certainly in my view is probably not. I think it's what may have some things that Owen sent, but some of it is probably what he scraped together after Edith had been working.
Well, that's one of the really important things, actually, is that the manuscripts were all over the place. I mean, Blunden had some, They were, you know, Harold Owen gave one of the manuscripts, I don't know whether it was Strange Meeting, I can't remember which one, to there's some in the Britten archive, you know, in the Benjamin Britten archive. So, you know, they kind of went all over the place. And also the fact that these were, and this is what you see in the letters and the correspondence, that these were kind of being passed back and forth in the post, you know, between, and certainly later on when Blunden does his edition, which could be another talk, and there's much more, actually Susan is much more involved in sort of about the sort of design and what she wants to see in the introduction. It's where she has the, I think you should remove the thing about beer. It's not quite Wilfred. So she gets more involved in that second edition. So yeah, so I think there might have been just one more. I realize we're kind of running out of time. Marcello, yes, Sassoon's work on the poem. It's also interesting how Sassoon pretty much begs Edmund Blunden to take on the editing of the 1931 edition. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a whole nother story in and of itself. And I you know, was thinking, oh, I'd love to talk about that one, but we'll stick with the 1920 for now. There is a lot more material to deal with that edition. So. Are there any other questions? As I realize we're on 8 o'clock. So
It's been wonderful, Jane. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Well,
you.
we'll
Thank
put
you very
this
much.
onto I think YouTube. Is that right, Bonnie? My dear colleague. Yeah. I don't know how that happens. I leave that to everyone else. But really look forward to, thank you so much to everybody who came and for your questions. I hope it was interesting, and that you'll join us in the coming months, or over the coming year. So that's the first Wednesday of every month, Thursday of every month, excuse me. Anyway, keep a look on Eventbrite and we'll be tweeting about it as well. And yeah, it's great to see so many people and hope to see you again soon.
Jane, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
My sister-in-law from California. Hello, Sandy Potter.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.